This podcast is brought to you by Mapper Forward's new Patreon community, the Global Coffee Think Tank. Check the show notes or head to patreon.com/mapperforward to find out how you can become a member today. Matt McCormack, welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, my friend whom I miss very, very much. We have a fascinating story of how we met. Do you remember how we met?
Yes, it was, so if I recall, so we were both living in San Diego and we went into, my wife and I went into a coffee place in downtown San Diego, and I had ordered a double espresso, and you remembered me from Bondi, from
in Sydney.
Yeah, so you'd remembered me from then, and we caught that you had the Australian accent, and always happy to find more Aussies. So yeah, we've kind of sparked up a friendship.
Yeah, and the rest is history. We became really close friends, and I saw your first child come into the world, the beautiful Beau. Now you've got two gorgeous kids, and you're living back in Melbourne, and I'm living in Sydney, and I have been looking for an excuse to have you on the podcast for a number of years now, and the perfect opportunity has arisen because we're going to be talking about cybersecurity and cybercrime. And so to get us started, why don't you tell everyone what you do and all the good stuff?
Yep. So I've been in the sort of cybersecurity industry for about 20 years, actually 19 years. Now I look at it. I work for a large security company. Their standard disclaimer that all the stuff I'm going to talk about is kind of general in nature and does not reflect my employer's views or anything like that. We're just going to talk today about a bit about to get people a bit of a sense of what that sort of cybercrime industry, at least a peek into parts of it, but then mostly about what are the things you need to be worrying about as an individual or as a small business, and also what don't you probably have to worry about, because there's we could worry ourselves sick, but we ultimately don't need to. There's a handful of things you can do to kind of target that 80-20, that Pareto's principle of get the 20% right, and then you get 80% of the value.
Oh, awesome. Excellent. In the coffee industry, and I know you're a huge coffee fan, so you have a vested interest in making sure that the coffee industry...
I need that supply chain to be healthy.
But there's a healthy kind of attitude in the coffee industry that's not so healthy, which is the coffee industry doesn't need to worry about cybersecurity. It's not really going to affect us.
Yeah, and this is not just that. I think that this is probably a small to medium business mindset generally, and for most people, it's kind of people subscribe to the security by obscurity mindset. So, they don't know me or who am I as a target. But ultimately, if you as a business, if you've got any money or assets, or you may be a target, and it's not that necessarily people are going to target you as an individual. It's just that you might just be part of a larger campaign and you happen to get kind of breached. It's nothing personal. You're just a target. So statistically, these days, you are probably likely to have to encounter some kind of cybersecurity incident, especially if you're a business. It's just statistically likely. It's not that you're being targeted specifically.
So we're going to have 5 episodes on this. In the first one now, we're going to talk about the kind of history of cybercrime. And then after that, we're going to talk about threat models. And then we're going to talk about what you do if you do find yourself in a compromising situation with regards to cyber. And then we're going to talk about small to medium business and some steps that small to medium business owners can take around cybersecurity. And then in the final episode, we're going to talk about what you do if you do get hacked. So Matt, do you want to give us an idea of where cybercrime came from? Because when I was a kid, I'm really showing my age now, I'm in my mid-40s. When I was a kid, none of this shit existed. Yeah, because we didn't have computers.
No, that's right. And we didn't have to worry about this sort of stuff. And it's, I mean, it has largely evolved with, you know, I think as we become more of an online world, of course, it has evolved kind of in concert with that, as has every other industry, right? And it's important to think now about, you know, the modern day cybersecurity industry. You know, it's $1 billion business on the defensive side, you know, the vendors who provide security services, but on the other side of the fence, you know, the cyber criminals, that's a multi-billion-dollar industry
Limitless.
as well. So it's especially with the thanks to kind of Bitcoin and all of that, you know, cryptocurrencies, and then those exploding in value. So it is, particularly from, you know, if you're from Eastern Europe, places like that now, countries where it is, you are very unlikely to get punished if you get caught doing this stuff. It's a really fruitful business to get into, unfortunately. You know, you probably make more money ripping off people in the West than you would as a normal software developer. So, you know, depending on where you sit on the kind of ethics spectrum, you know, if it's out of sight, out of mind, then yeah, it's pretty fruitful. But it wasn't always that way. So I started in the industry. It was an Australian antivirus company called Vet Antivirus, and used to distribute, you know, antivirus updates on floppy disks to customers. So it was a while ago.
Oh, the floppy disk.
Yeah, I remember back in those days. But so, you know, originally, kind of the viruses started out really as a bit of a technical, you know, various virus crews or VX crews kind of showing off their technical expertise against each other, right? Like I can write a virus that is what we call polymorphic or metamorphic, and, you know, infect files, and it'll be different every time, and it'd be really impossible to kind of clean up for any viruses. So it was at that time it was more of a nuisance, right? As we start getting online as a world, you know, that quickly starts to change, because people start to realize, well, now, you know, there's opportunities to be made for money, right? So about in the late 90s, there was a hacking crew called the Loft Crew, who are quite familiar to a lot of people in the industry. One of the the heavyweights of the industry. They're actually called themselves Loft Heavy Industries, but they went before Congress in 1998 and talked to them about, look, this cybersecurity thing is a big deal. You know, we as a crew of, you know, misfits who work in IT, we could, you know, if we put our heads together, we were pretty confident we could take out the US internet in about half an hour. So they were pleading with lawmakers to really take this stuff seriously. Mudge, who was one of the members of that crew, is again very well known in the industry. He's now, I think, head of security at Twitter, but for a long time after that, he worked with the US government in various roles to really help them kind of shape both their defensive but also presumably offensive capabilities as well. And we talk about this offensive defense a lot in the industry. You kind of got a blue team for the offense, for the defense, and red team for the offense. And there's very different kind of career paths depending on your sort of skill sets, because it's a lot of people, you know, if you're a defender, you tend to be kind of trying to protect the systems and be familiar with how to look for anomalous activities, whereas as an attacker, you tend to be trying to find the bugs, find the holes, find the weaknesses. In many cases, people are just the weakness, as we'll go into later. But I digress, because so, you know, in the late 90s, this is happening. And then Microsoft itself starts taking security very seriously. In about 2003, there was a big worm is a malware that self-propagates called Blaster and Sasa. This is 2003. That. Yeah, and it starts spreading all across the internet, because at that stage, you know, home people didn't have routers and other things that were sort of blocking outside internet access. So if you connected your machine to the internet, it was completely exposed, and everyone across the world was doing that, and that was just normal, which is odd to think these days. So anyway, this thing just runs rampant, just infects most of the planet. And then they start thinking, okay, this is probably a big deal. We need to get serious about security. And as we'll discuss later, a vulnerability like that, the way that it was spreading was through a vulnerability in one of the software components in Windows that helps it communicate with other Windows machines. And that bug these days, if you found a bug that people were able to get what's called remote code execution. So they were able to contact your machine and without any interaction from the user, run code on a machine. That's worth millions these days. So, the exploit industry is a very big industry, and we'll discuss that later. Mm-hmm. But back then, much like it was, this was the early days of people making money off malware. So that was before a bug like that would be worth millions. Then we get into kind of online banking starts to become a thing. Mm-hmm. So of course, cyber criminals are like, hey, online banking, let's start targeting that. So that becomes a big theme from about 2004-05 onwards, and it still is today. Yes, from about then.
Was PayPal around the same time?
PayPal, I can't remember when PayPal started up, but it was, certainly. I think it was early days for online transactions because that was the niche they were serving, right, as a secure way to handle credit card details. So I'm guessing it was slightly earlier, but we certainly we see this sort of ramp up of now that there's online transactions, now that there is now that we have online banking, malware is evolving accordingly, right? And this is when we start seeing this kind of cybercrime underground really flourish. And I mean that the way to think about this is that we just have so many different kind of vendors specializing in different areas, right? So you would have people who write the malware that sells. Then you've got people who their only job is to modify the malware so that the antivirus don't detect it. Then you've got other people who specialize in distribution. You've got other people who specialize in the exploits, so vulnerabilities to help with the distribution. Then other people that will take all the stolen data and sell that, and then other people will use the stolen data for some kind of fraud. And that's pretty broad, but that's kind of, you can think about this cybercrime underground. It's just this whole network of people who specialize in different areas and sell their services to each other. And this still happens now and in a big way with ransomware and other things. So this kind of goes on until about 2009 is when the industry gets a bit of a wake up, and that's when we run into Stuxnet. So Stuxnet was one of the first pieces of malware that the antivirus industry really ran into that was nation state in a large way. So it was it used 4 previously unknown vulnerabilities to be moving around. It was very sophisticated. It was using really low level things called drivers on your machine that were signed as a legitimate vendor. It was completely unlike anything we'd seen before in terms of the sophistication and in the way it's been developed. And that's when I think the industry gets a bit of a wake up call that it's no longer just these cyber criminals getting into this game now. It's also governments using this stuff.
Wow. So
the Stuxnet is theorized to be a kind of joint Israel and US program called MIRTUS. And it was used, the intention of it was to try and slow down to take out nuclear facilities in the Middle East was the purpose of it.
The justification was that we're going to use this for this main purpose, and then things like the Patriot Act come along and they can use it for a whole bunch of other purposes?
I think it was just that was the main purpose of it. As far as we understand, it had a whole bunch of different kind of modules that it could download and use. One of the main ones was that got everyone's attention with the one that appeared to be targeting nuclear reactors. But I think it was just a case of it was designed to kind of spread, and then it ended up getting on someone's machine where it shouldn't have. So I was working for Microsoft at the time, and we kind of got tipped off about it because of Mark Rasinovich, who writes a bunch of tools for Windows called sysinternals, and now he works for Microsoft. He kind of gave us the heads up. It's like, hey, I've got a customer here who's saying he's got this weird driver installed in his machine. Can you guys take a look? And that was kind of actually the first, just by chance, that someone noticed there was something weird on the machine. And then, yeah, kind of the rest is history. We had a detection for it, and then, the industry kind of jumped on board, and a lot of people did some really great research to really pick it apart and find out what was going on there. And I mean, lots of been written about Stuxnet, so you can read up all about it. But that was a bit of a turning point. And that kind of brings us into, this area where we've got kind of nation state government actors, we've got exploits, and then so you've got this. Now there's entire industry based around just vulnerabilities and exploits. So we've got bug hunting. You've got your HackerOne and these other ones you may have heard of, which allow just your average person to kind of, with permission, hack certain companies with the company's permission to try and find bugs in their software or their websites, or all these kind of things. And this is a common thing in the industry. You'll often get a third-party security review on your software to try and make sure there's not any glaring bugs or design problems in the architecture or the way you're thinking about the security. Or you'll, as a company, you often get, especially as larger companies, get penetration tests. So, like, can you break into my company? And if so, how did you do it? What do I need to do to fix it? And this is really common now in the industry, but back certainly 2009, 10, it wasn't. So there's an entire industry around kind of finding these bugs and then selling them. But then in the middle there is a responsible disclosure, ideally, of a lot of these bugs. So sometimes you'll get, security researchers or companies who deal in this space will contact the vendors and say, look, someone's told us about this fairly devastating bug in your software. Let's work together to make sure that you release a patch for it before we, disclose that we have this vulnerability. And this is a kind of a common thing. Google, for example, when they find bugs in other people's stuff, they have a team who deal with this, probably more than one, but at least one, called Project Zero. When they find bugs in software, they'll work with a vendor and they give them 90 days to be able to do something about it before they'll publicly release that they found a bug. So that's a common thing. But exploits now are such a kind of big deal because they give a bit of a magic bullet to an attacker. So they're such a big deal now. They're included in what's called the Wassenaar Agreement, or Wassenaar Agreement, depending if you're German or not. It's basically an arms control agreement across countries to make sure that it's supposed to ensure that arms trades don't undermine regional stability and security. Right. So security bugs now are considered to be such a large large issue now that they're considered to be weapons. Especially in this kind of like cyber war, they would be the first thing deployed. And this is kind of why like companies and countries presumably are hoarding this stuff. So, for example, China, there's entire security conferences that are dedicated to mobile phone hacking. China used to wipe the floor with every other. So usually there's teams of people who are competing against each other at these conferences or events to try and hack something, right? And they'll do it within a day. You can look it up. One's called Pwn to Own, which is really common. So they'll have like one day where they've got a bunch of, they'll have a set of software, and then they've got to hack it and get from, they typically called capture the flag. So you have to kind of get from A to B using software vulnerabilities, for example, that you recently discovered. And
this is nuts.
Yeah, I know it's a dynamic industry. So at these kind of conferences, typically the Chinese teams, Tencent or QQ, these sponsored by these teams, these companies, they would wipe the floor with everyone else. They were just amazing at the bugs they would be finding. And then a few years ago, the Chinese government basically said, "Hey, no more releasing these bugs at these conferences to win competitions." Presumably, they would prefer to have them themselves for their own use. Yeah, like hold on.
Hello, what are allegedly we doing? Huawei.
Yeah, allegedly, right? Yeah. So it's you're getting these these brilliant young kids coming up in the industry who just Jedis at hacking stuff, and then
they're all 13 years old, right?
We've been to conferences. So even here in Australia, we have some really good security conferences and have similar kind of competitions, not to that extent, but capture the flags, and often, and especially a lot of the there's a good conference called B-Sides, for example, and they really try to encourage high school students and other things to come in, the whole STEM thing, let's get girls and boys interested in computer security, because there's a massive need for people. And they'll come along and participate in these kind of games, these capture the flags, which is to set up toy websites and other things to get hacked so that people can win points and then go to the next stage. Seeing some kids who weren't even in this industry come in and do really well. So
it's so smart. Gamify the job. Of course, kids are going to want to get into it, and they're going to think it's kind of cool.
Absolutely. And there's companies that are just kind of based on this to do this capture the flag stuff. There's a few, and I can send you some after this when you put them in the show notes if you want. There's there's absolutely, you can sort of sign up and basically you get to hack computers that have a vulnerability, and so you need to find you need to kind of level up your skills in order to hack the computers, and then you move on to the next one that's a little bit harder and maybe has a slightly different bug in it. So this is really common and a great way to practice, especially if you're for someone who wants to kind of get into the industry.
That sounds amazing.
So vulnerability, I just want to make sure we talked about the whole vulnerability exploit thing. It's a big industry. The big bugs are worth a lot of money, or ideally are at least responsibly disclosed before they show up, on someone's phone. But these days, I just want to make sure we understand that you don't need these sophisticated bugs in order to get hacked. Majority of the hacking these days of companies and people is going to be some kind of social engineering that didn't really require any technical knowledge. And we'll cover that later. But that, I've kind of jumped from about 2010 to now, which is, there's been a lot of banking Trojans, and then there was ransomware that kind of evolved, but especially since cryptocurrency has really taken off now, so is ransomware. I sort of, the first ransomware I worked on was probably 2000. I reverse engineered a malware and wrote a cleaning tool for it in 2004 or something. But it's hard for people to get the, as a bad person who wants to encrypt someone's stuff and then get the ransom, you need to be able to get the ransom to you without
them
leaving a trace so that they know who you are. So, and that's where Bitcoin comes in really handy, right? Or some of these other cryptocurrencies. So now, because of Bitcoin, I think there's an explosion in any kind of this, these activities that would otherwise be easier to trace. Or as mentioned before, if you operate in Russia or somewhere, then as long as you're paying a cut to to the police and people involved, then it doesn't really matter. They let you do whatever you want. I think we've had a few high-profile arrests over the years of Russian nationals who get lured out of their country, under the auspices of maybe a bride waiting for them in Portugal or something, to get arrested by the US. And the response from Russia is, don't leave Russia, and you'll be fine. Yeah.
You're allowed to do this shit here, so why would you go anywhere else?
Exactly. Yeah. If you don't leave Russia, if you leave Russia, then we can't basically, let you keep doing it as long as we're getting a cut. So these days, I think I'm going to focus on ransomware a bit because it is really one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with at the moment. A long time, these were like kind of sent out like any other malware, right? You'd have by email, maybe an attachment, some kind of social engineering to get you to click a link and download and run something, maybe use an exploit, but which used to be a lot more popular before software makers and operating system makers got a lot better at making sure that you patch. So we'll go into this later, but patching, easiest thing you can do. Exploit.
What's that mean?
Yeah, so exploiting a software vulnerability or a hole in the software.
Oh, right.
So, the patches that your operating system make you install and restart all the time, and your phone makes you update, those are usually fixing bugs that could be exploited by someone else, right? So it's making sure your patch is important, but we'll get to that. Originally the ransomware was kind of sent out, click on stuff, install stuff, and to be honest, look, the social engineering stuff is still the biggest way that people get done, but it evolves, right? So you might remember a couple of years ago, WannaCry was a big deal. It was one of the ransomwares that was taking out hospitals and all sorts of stuff, because that was paired with an exploit for a vulnerability that hadn't been patched yet. It was what we call a 0-day. So it was when someone drops an exploit for a vulnerability that no one knew existed. So it's a vulnerability or a bug in software that no one knew existed except for the person who found it. And then they write a proof of concept to show that they can use this bug to run code, and then they just put it on the internet and let havoc ensue.
Rookie question.
That happened
about that. Mm-hmm. So, is it that somebody's created this bug, they release it and try and cause havoc, and then they give it to their friends to do as much havoc as they want? Or do they sell a bug to other people to try and create havoc? And is this time sensitive?
It depends. So there's different you probably have different scenarios. You have the security researcher finds a bug, responsibly discloses to the vendor, look, I found a bug in your software. It could be really bad if everyone else found out about this. You should patch it. That's the ideal scenario. Mm-hmm. Then there is, I find a bug and then I sell it to a third party, and then I wipe my hands of it and I don't know what they're going to do with it.
Right.
Third party might be government, or it might be one of these kind of clandestine hacking groups who work on behalf of governments or behalf of whoever else, and we'll get into an example of that later. Or it might be that they find a bug and then they kind of, as a security researcher, they find a bug and they want to make sure that they get some kind of fame out of it, right? Because it's good for your profile. It can still be good for your profile while responsibly disclosing. I just want to make sure everyone understands that. So responsible disclosure is the important thing. But some people just, they might do it. In the case of the WannaCry vulnerability is interesting. So what it was actually was Russia hacked a machine that the NSA was using to hack Russia, and they had bugs. They had this vulnerability on the machine. So Russia disclosed all of these 0 days, these unpatched software bugs.
To who? They disclose it to who?
Well, as in they made it public. They made these bugs public through an intermediary with like a fake persona. But, it is believed to have been Russia. And anyway, so they made these bugs public. People take the exploits for the bugs and then put it in malware to spread ransomware. So this is how WannaCry became such a big deal, because not only was it was spreading using a bug that 48 hours before was completely unknown to anyone, and it didn't have a patch, and it was a Windows bug, and everyone runs Windows.
Wow.
And it was one that the NSA had been using to hack other people previously, so it was pretty effective. So this was why, WannaCry became such a big thing, taking out hospitals, schools, anyone, because it was fairly indiscriminate in how it would spread. Typically, you don't see those that scale, but it's totally feasible. More recently, in terms of the extension of this kind of thing, is hacking groups targeting certain companies of, certain. How you become a target is varied. It might be that they just managed to get some credentials off the black market for your company. So then they try them, and if they work, they'll and if you're a big enough company or they think they can get some money out of you, they'll hack in, or they might have found a bug in some one of your publicly facing kind of websites or something like that. There's a lot of ways you can get in, or they'll just social engineer, right? They'll email and see if they can get in that way. But one way or another, they get in, they have a look through the network to find anything that's really high value, and then they make sure that gets encrypted and ransomed. So with the intention of doing the most damage, stopping business to maximize the chance that you're going to pay a ransom. So that's really common.
So if I understand that correctly, what they do is they get in, they find something that's valuable to you, they make it inaccessible to you.
Yep.
Until you pay some money, and they'll give it back to you, even though you owned it in the first place.
Yeah. So this is what ransomware does, right? This is what it'll gets on your machine, encrypts it, encrypts the important stuff, and then requires you pay a ransom to have it decrypted. And this is really the fundamental. That's really the fundamentals of the whole ransomware industry. And I probably should have mentioned that before. I'm probably assuming that.
We're going to talk about it in the next episode a little bit more, because this goes to the heart of what I've been kind of trying to shake the coffee industry up a little bit about. Like, it's not that they're necessarily going to hack you, but they may hack, let's say, Square, which a lot of people in the industry use as their POS systems, and it's the only way they receive payment for their product. And so if Square gets hacked, all of a sudden you've been cut at the knees of being able to receive. Well, unless you've got backup plans for how to do that, but you're immediately vulnerable because of what's going to happen. So why don't we wrap up this episode? Then in the next episode, we're going to talk about other kinds of threat models. And I want to actually help maybe get you to help define a couple of really fundamental things for people, because a lot of the coffee industry have been completely ignoring all of this stuff, and now because of what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, they're like, should we be paying attention to this? I'm like, you should have been paying attention a little while ago, but yes, this is a good time to get you to start thinking about it. So let's come back in the next episode and we'll start talking about other threat models.
Okay,
cool. Okay, peace, love and peanut butter, everybody. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks, friends. If you enjoyed this video, here's what you should check out next. Consider supporting Map It Forward on Patreon, and be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell before you leave.